deep within the heart of the Middle East, positioned precariously at the harsh, unforgiving crossroads of continents and ancient human civilizations, lies a nation defined by its profound and startling contrasts. This is a mere sliver of land, a territory so geographically constrained that an individual could traverse its entire breadth by car in a matter of a few short hours. Yet, contained within these tight, historically contested borders exists a world of staggering ecological and topographical diversity. To the far south, the landscape is utterly dominated by the sun-scorched expanse of the Negev Desert. Here, the temperature routinely bakes the ancient limestone, and the horizon is a vast, silent ocean of jagged craters and arid valleys where only the most resilient forms of life can endure the relentless daytime heat. In stark opposition, the northern reaches of this same small nation reveal the lush, rolling green hills of the Galilee region. It is a fertile, heavily cultivated terrain where cool morning mists blanket agricultural valleys and the soil holds the damp richness of seasonal rains. This is a place where the crushing, monumental weight of 4,000 years of human history is not merely a distant concept read about in textbooks. It is a tangible, heavy presence, deeply etched into the weathered, wind-worn surfaces of the ancient stones that form its oldest cities. This history is intricately woven into the very fabric of the regional identity, dictating the rhythms of life, the placement of architecture, and the deeply held beliefs of its inhabitants. Yet, operating in direct, almost jarring parallel to this ancient foundation is a land of relentless, forward-driving momentum. It is an epicenter of modern innovation, a highly developed society defined by a vibrant, fast-paced, and intensely competitive energy. This is Israel. It is a country where highly guarded sacred sites, revered for millennia by the followers of three of the world's major religions, stand resolutely just a short, modern highway drive away from gleaming, glass-fronted technology campuses. It is a geographic anomaly where ancient traditions are not treated as fragile relics of the past to be kept behind museum glass, but are rather lived, breathed, and actively practiced in the daily rhythm of millions of lives. These deeply rooted conservative religious customs are forced to coexist, sometimes uneasily, with a highly secular, cosmopolitan, and globally connected culture. To truly understand life here is to understand this constant, dynamic, and never-ending interplay between the deeply ancient and the hyper-modern. It requires observing the daily friction between the sacred and the profane, between the heavy gravitational pull of historical memory and the powerful, driving ambition toward the future. This is not a story of the loud, chaotic headlines or the bitter regional conflicts that dominate international news broadcasts. Instead, this is an immersive observation of the quiet, everyday realities, the micro-habits, and the survival mechanisms of the diverse populations who call this fiercely complex and compelling land their home. The rhythm of daily life in this region begins long before the sun has fully broken over the eastern horizon, and the manner of this awakening unfolds in drastically different ways depending on your exact geographical coordinates. In the ancient, elevated city of Jerusalem, the early morning arrives with a heavy sense of quiet, almost overwhelming reverence. Long before the traffic begins, the first weak light of dawn slowly illuminates the massive blocks of Jerusalem stone, a distinctive pale gold-tinted limestone that has quietly witnessed the violent and sacred passage of millennia. The auditory landscape of a Jerusalem morning is deeply layered. The day might officially commence with the highly amplified, haunting sound of the Muslim call to prayer, the adhan, cutting through the cold morning air from the high minaret of a neighborhood mosque. This solitary voice is soon joined by the heavy, rhythmic peal of heavy bronze church bells echoing from the Christian quarters, and the quiet, rhythmic murmur of Jewish men swaying in deep, focused prayer beside massive ancient retaining walls. Here, the morning routine is heavily steeped in a sense of absolute timelessness. A slow walk through the notoriously narrow, winding and unevenly paved stone alleys of the old city reveals a world waking up in much the same deliberate manner as it has for countless centuries. Local shopkeepers arrive in the pre-dawn chill, their hands gripping cold iron as they begin the physical labor of rolling up heavy, rusted, metal security shutters, the loud, clanking mechanical noise echoing sharply against the stone corridors. Slowly, the damp, cold air of the narrow streets is displaced by a powerful olfactory explosion. The thick, comforting aroma of large, flat loaves of bread, freshly baked in ancient wood-fired stone ovens, begins to drift outward. This scent immediately intertwines with the sharp, pungent, and highly caffeinated smell of strong black coffee, heavily spiced with crushed green cardamom pods, brewing slowly in small copper pots over open flames. However, a mere 1-hour drive down the winding mountain highways to the west, descending towards the coastal plain, reveals an atmosphere that feels as though it belongs on another planet. The dense urban sprawl of Tel Aviv awakens to a completely different, kinetic energy. This city serves as the modern, unapologetically secular and economic heart of Israel. It is a metropolis that lives, breathes, and constantly builds itself right on the humid shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Here, the morning routine is aggressively active, physical, and entirely outward-looking. Long before the heat of the day sets in, the wide beachfront promenade, locally known as the toilet, is already heavily congested with human movement. It is a constant stream of heavily perspiring joggers hitting the pavement, focused cyclists navigating the lanes, and local residents engaging in the daily ritual of walking their dogs along the sea wall. The aesthetic here is starkly different from the modest attire of Jerusalem. The countless open-air cafes that line the major boulevards and side streets are already buzzing with loud, animated conversations as sharply dressed residents and tech workers grab a highly concentrated shot of espresso and a flaky pastry on their rushed, frantic commute to their offices. The culture in this coastal hub is aggressively informal, direct, and pulsating with raw energy. The day does not begin with quiet religious contemplation, but rather with the immediate mechanical hum of heavy commuter traffic, the rapid-fire chatter of business negotiations on mobile phones, and the steady, rhythmic crashing of salty Mediterranean waves against the concrete breakwaters. Whether situated in a quiet, dust-blown desert development in the deep south, a tightly organized, ideologically driven communal farming village known as a kibbutz, or the intensely crowded, bustling urban centers along the coastal plain, the concept of community serves as the absolute, unshakable bedrock of this society. The physical layout of the neighborhoods often reflects this deep-seated need for connection. Apartment buildings are clustered closely together. Balconies overlook shared courtyards, and the strict line between private domestic spaces and the public sphere is highly porous. Street life here is not merely a byproduct of urban planning. It is a vibrant, essential, and highly active component of existence. It is out on the unevenly paved sidewalks, within the heavily shaded local parks, where elderly men aggressively play backgammon, and especially inside the loud, chaotic, and heavily congested open-air markets known locally as the Shuk, that the daily life of the community truly unfolds and exposes its rawest nerves. Within these markets, such as the legendary Mahane Yehuda in Jerusalem or the sprawling Carmel market in Tel Aviv, the sensory overload is immediate and absolute. Narrow, covered alleyways trap the intense heat of the day alongside a chaotic symphony of human interaction. Here, the local population does not merely arrive to mechanically purchase their weekly groceries, they arrive to vigorously engage. They meet, they shout across crowded aisles to distant acquaintances, they argue passionately and loudly about complex regional politics with total strangers, and they rapidly exchange vital news concerning the health and marriages of their extended families. The visual landscape of the Shuk is a riot of texture and colour. Massive overflowing burlap sacks of raw, unroasted spices filling the thick air with the heavy, intoxicating dust of cumin, turmeric, and dried chili. Towering, meticulously arranged pyramids of bright, locally grown citrus fruits, and heavy, glistening mounds of dark, oil-cured olives. The deeply ingrained concept of family itself stands as the absolute, immovable cornerstone of the broader culture. The nuclear family is rarely isolated. It is an extremely common, almost expected societal norm for multiple, heavily intertwined generations to reside permanently within the exact same city limits, often within walking distance of one another. Consequently, family gatherings are not rare, formalized events relegated to major holidays. They are frequent, intensely loud, emotionally charged, and form the very central axis around which all other social life painfully revolves. In a harsh, historically contested geographic region that is often characterized by extreme geopolitical instability, sudden military conflicts, and deep economic pressures, this powerful, suffocatingly close sense of community and family provides a deeply rooted psychological support system. It acts as an essential, heavy anchor of emotional and physical stability in a reality that is frequently entirely unpredictable. To attempt to speak of a single, unified national identity in this land is to completely overlook the exceptionally rich, profoundly complex, and often heavily challenging mosaic of distinct, ancient cultures that are forced to share this tiny territory. The dominant identity of the nation is, undeniably, deeply rooted in its ancient Jewish heritage, a historical, religious, and spiritual connection to this specific soil that spans thousands of recorded years. Yet, this heritage is not a static museum display. It is a living, breathing, and constantly evolving part of the modern present. The Hebrew language, an ancient, sacred tongue that lay essentially dormant for 2 millennia, used exclusively for religious study, has been forcefully and miraculously revived. Today, it is the rapid-fire, guttural, and highly vibrant language of the asphalt street, of high-stakes corporate business, and of contemporary art. The fundamental rhythm of the secular week is entirely shaped and dictated by the ancient strictures of the Jewish lunar calendar, steadily building toward the profound weekly climax of Shabbat, the mandated day of absolute rest. As the sun begins to lower toward the horizon on a Friday afternoon, a heavy, deeply palpable and almost physical shift in the atmosphere occurs across the entire country. The frantic, aggressive pace of the modern work week begins to rapidly decelerate. In the ancient hills of Jerusalem and within other deeply religious enclaves, public life comes to a sudden, grinding halt. Heavy metal security grates are pulled down over storefronts with a final, echoing clang. The sprawling networks of public transportation cease all operations, removing the constant hum of heavy diesel engines from the streets. A profound, almost eerie quiet descends upon the stone architecture, broken only by the sound of footsteps as sharply dressed families hurry toward the synagogue, gathering later around long tables bathed in the warm, flickering glow of candlelight for the traditional, heavily ritualized Friday night dinner. However, this society is absolutely not a monolith. It is a highly fragmented, multicultural landscape where numerous distinct, historically rooted communities live side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in deep tension. The Arab-Israeli community, comprising both devout Muslims and Christians, constitutes over 20% of the nation's total population. They are an ancient, integral and inseparable part of the nation's cultural fabric, possessing their own deeply rich traditions, complex historical narratives, and utilizing the Arabic language as their primary tongue. In ancient, bustling northern cities like Nazareth and the mixed coastal metropolis of Haifa, Arab culture is vibrant, highly visible, and sensory-rich. It dominates the culinary landscape with the heavy scent of slow-roasted lamb, complex spice blends of za'atar, and the sharp, acidic bite of fresh sumac, while the complex, quarter-tone melodies of traditional Arabic music echo from passing cars and open cafe windows. Further north, nestled high within the cool, mist-shrouded and heavily forested northern mountain regions of the Galilee and the Carmel Range, reside the Druze. They are a unique, Arabic-speaking religious minority group who practice a highly secretive, esoteric faith that split from Islam in the 11th century. Living in tightly knit, almost impenetrable high-altitude villages, the Druze maintain their own fiercely protected, distinct traditions, wearing traditional dark robes and pristine white head coverings. They possess an incredibly strong, unyielding sense of community identity and loyalty, heavily shaped by their isolation in the steep, terraced mountainsides. This staggering demographic diversity is a constant source of immense cultural richness, offering a dizzying array of perspectives, cuisines, and philosophies within a tiny geographic footprint. Yet, it simultaneously presents continuous, exhausting, and highly complex daily challenges of coexistence, political representation, and social integration. History in this land is entirely inescapable. It is not a distant, abstract subject to be studied passively in academic libraries. It is a present, powerful, and often violent force that has fundamentally shaped the psychological identity of every single community. The collective, inherited memory of historical triumphs, devastating ancient tragedies, and unyielding religious narratives directly informs the modern worldview of every inhabitant. Simply existing here requires navigating a harsh daily reality, where ancient, blood-soaked history and hyper-modern ambition are locked in a constant, aggressive dialogue, violently shaping the chaotic present and uncertainly defining the trajectory of the future. Operating side by side in an almost jarring physical proximity to the heavy, silent weight of its ancient historical ruins, this deeply complex nation has aggressively cultivated one of the most hyper-dynamic, ruthlessly innovative, and rapidly accelerating economic engines on the planet. The country is universally recognized as a global powerhouse in the high-technology sector, a heavily concentrated coastal strip frequently referred to in international business circles as Silicon Wadi. This sprawling, dense ecosystem of aggressive startup ventures, high-stakes venture capital fortresses, and massive multinational research and development centers is heavily clustered along the humid, heavily congested coastal plain surrounding the Tel Aviv metropolis. The internal working culture within this specific sector is deeply characterized by a blisteringly fast pace, a surprisingly informal social atmosphere where formal business attire is practically non-existent, and an unyielding spirit of relentless, almost obsessive technological innovation. It is an intensely pressurized, highly competitive world entirely populated by extremely young, highly educated, and aggressively ambitious engineers and entrepreneurs. They are driven forward by a deeply ingrained cultural ethos that aggressively encourages high-stakes risk-taking, demands rapid execution, and, crucially, actively destigmatizes spectacular financial or operational failure, viewing it merely as an essential, painful stepping stone to ultimate success. This highly celebrated startup nation mythology has rapidly solidified into a massive foundational pillar of the modern secular identity in this region. However, to view this economy solely through the polished, heavily air-conditioned glass of high-tech towers is to completely misunderstand the physical reality of the land. The economy is drastically far from being one-dimensional. Agriculture, for instance, has fundamentally served as the absolute, physically grueling cornerstone of the modern nation's survival narrative from its very inception. Confronted directly by a violently arid climate, punishingly high seasonal temperatures, and critically, terrifyingly limited natural freshwater resources, the early farmers and subsequent generations of agronomists were forced by sheer existential necessity to become radical pioneers in agricultural technology. Out in the blinding, suffocating heat of the deep desert valleys and the dusty, wind-swept plains, they engineered heavily monitored precision techniques like the revolutionary drip irrigation system. Imagine miles of thin, black plastic tubing winding through cracked, desperate earth, delivering a slow, perfectly calculated and highly computerized rhythmic release of single water droplets directly to the root systems of crops, completely bypassing the massive evaporation losses of traditional farming. This desperate, brilliant adaptation has miraculously revolutionized farming in hostile, dry climates globally. Today, defying extreme ecological logic, this tiny, arid country produces a staggering, highly engineered abundance of bright, water-heavy fruits, robust vegetables, and delicate export-grade flowers, transforming barren limestone dust into hyper-productive, tightly controlled green matrices. Furthermore, the heavy, constant influx of global tourism serves as another massive, vital pillar bearing the weight of the national economy, drawing millions of international visitors annually to its intensely contested historical, deeply religious, and starkly beautiful natural sites. From the heavy, solemn, and heavily guarded sacred landmarks of the old city of Jerusalem to the blistering, intense resort heat of Eilat, situated on the extreme southern tip of the Red Sea, the vast tourism and hospitality industry provides essential daily livelihoods for a massive, highly diverse segment of the working population. Operating alongside these massive macro industries, the true, grinding daily pulse of the local economy is heavily powered by countless thousands of small, family-owned businesses. From the loud, rhythmic metallic hammering echoing from narrow neighborhood automotive workshops to the frantic, high-heat energy of tightly packed, family-run restaurants. These highly resilient micro-enterprises form the absolute unbreakable backbone of local neighborhood communities. They physically reflect a deeply rooted culture of extreme hard work, stubborn psychological resilience, and a deeply seated, almost aggressive, entrepreneurial spirit born from a history of having to constantly build and rebuild from the ground up. This extreme diversity is perhaps most immediately and viscerally experienced through the food. The culinary landscape is a direct, deeply physical, and intensely flavorful reflection of both its harsh, sun-baked geography and its highly fractured, remarkably diverse immigrant heritage. The cuisine is a violent, vibrant, and incredibly successful fusion of broader Middle Eastern traditions colliding heavily with Mediterranean sensibilities. It is a food culture entirely built around the strict, uncompromising use of fresh, heavily seasonal, and locally cultivated agricultural ingredients. The concept of eating fresh is not a modern dietary trend or a marketing slogan here. It is a rigid, daily mandate, a fundamental, non-negotiable law of the domestic food culture. As previously noted, the chaotic, heavily congested open-air markets, the Shuk, function as the loud, violently beating heart of this entire culinary scene. However, the experience extends far beyond the sensory overload of raw ingredients. The daily domestic diet is aggressively rich in locally grown vegetables. Salads here are absolutely never treated as a passive, optional side dish. They are a massive, brightly colored, and heavily seasoned central feature of almost every single meal, including breakfast. Most famously, the finely, almost obsessively hand-chopped local salad, a sharp, highly acidic and crunchy mixture of firm red tomatoes, crisp green cucumbers, and sharp white onions, heavily drenched in thick, golden olive oil and raw lemon juice, is a ubiquitous daily staple. Freshly baked bread is equally essential, serving not just as calories, but as the primary physical utensil. Whether it is the humble, highly functional, pocketed pita bread, perfectly engineered for tearing and aggressively scooping up heavy, garlic-laden mounds of warm hummus, or the rich, heavily braided, egg-washed challah bread that serves as the ceremonial, deeply symbolic centerpiece of the heavy Friday night Shabbat dinner, carbohydrates are central to survival and social cohesion. Out on the loud, heavily trafficked asphalt, street food is a massive obsession. It operates as a highly democratic, great social equalizer, heavily consumed by individuals from absolutely all socio-economic backgrounds, standing shoulder to shoulder on crowded, greasy sidewalks. The sharp, overwhelming and highly recognizable hiss of ground, heavily spiced chickpea batter, hitting violently boiling vats of dark oil to form incredibly crispy, dark brown falafel balls, is the soundtrack of the urban lunch hour. These boiling spheres are immediately stuffed into a steaming, freshly baked pita, violently crammed with handfuls of sharp, acidic salads and drowning in thick, nutty sesame tahini sauce. Just steps away, the slow, mesmerizing and highly hypnotic rotation of a massive, heavily layered shawarma spit dominates the sidewalk. Huge stacked cones of marinated meat slowly roast next to an open, roaring gas flame. The rich, seasoned fat slowly rendering and dripping continuously onto the metal collection trays below, before the heavily caramelized outer layers are violently shaved off with a sharp knife. Yet, despite the chaotic energy of the streets, the absolute undisputed emotional core of the food culture remains firmly rooted inside the private, heavily guarded sanctuary of the home. Massive extended family meals are deeply cherished, highly protected weekly rituals. They represent a critical, protected time for deep interpersonal connection, loud arguments, and the chaotic sharing of food. A typical heavy weekend dinner might feature a massive, table-covering collection of mezze, dozens of small, highly seasoned dishes of warm hummus, heavily smoked and charred eggplant, baba ganoush, sharp tahini, and countless complex, spicy vegetable salads. This overwhelming appetizer course is inevitably followed by a massive main presentation of aggressively fire-grilled meats, locally caught Mediterranean fish, or a heavy, slow-simmered, spice-laden vegetable and meat stew that has been cooking over a low flame for many hours. From the cheapest, most frantic sidewalk street food stand to the most heavily structured, emotionally complex family feast, food in this land is fundamentally about far more than mere biological sustenance. It is an aggressive, daily assertion of survival, a vital tool for community building, a fierce defense of ancient traditions, and a loud, highly seasoned celebration of sharp, vibrant, and powerful flavors wrung from a harsh and unforgiving landscape. For a nation geographically defined by its severe, highly contested limitations in square mileage, this land possesses a startlingly diverse, fiercely beautiful, and highly extreme natural landscape. This environment is absolutely never treated merely as a passive, scenic backdrop to modern life. It is a highly active, heavily integrated, and deeply foundational component of the national identity. It serves as a necessary, cherished, and often desperately needed psychological escape from the suffocating intensity, high stress, and dense concrete of the urban centers. The long, heavily populated western Mediterranean coastline functions essentially as the country's collective, sun-drenched playground. The wide, densely packed sandy beaches bordering cities like Tel Aviv and the northern industrial port of Haifa are a central, non-negotiable arena of daily life. Here, the sensory experience is dominated by the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the water, the heavy, humid smell of salt and sunscreen, and the sharp, rhythmic, and continuously echoing thwack of small, hard rubber balls being aggressively hit back and forth in the ubiquitous, fast-paced local paddle game known as matcot. Journeying southward, the topography violently and abruptly transforms, giving way entirely to the vast, unforgiving and majestic desolation of the Negev Desert. This massive, arid region consumes over half the country's entire landmass. It is a harsh, silent world defined by stark, terrifying beauty. Massive, naturally formed geological craters that look like open, jagged wounds in the Earth's crust, heavily concealed, trickling water oases hidden deep within shaded, narrow canyons, and ancient wind-sculpted rock formations baking under a merciless, blinding sun. The desert here is not feared or avoided as an empty, dangerous wasteland. Rather, it is actively pursued by the population as an arena for intense physical adventure, deep historical connection, and profound, silent spiritual renewal away from the noise of the coastal plain. Further east, descending rapidly into the lowest terrestrial elevation on the surface of the planet, lies one of the Earth's most alien and unique natural anomalies, the Dead Sea. The environment here is surreal, heavy, and physically oppressive. The air is exceptionally thick, aggressively hot, and heavily saturated with bromides that blur the distant Jordanian mountains. The water itself is incredibly, toxically saline, nearly 10 times saltier than the open ocean, and heavily rich in ancient, concentrated minerals. It possesses a strange, thick, almost oily viscosity. Submerging oneself in these silent, completely lifeless waters creates a bizarre, entirely unique physical sensation, forcing the human body to float effortlessly, bobbing on the surface like a piece of dry wood, while the harsh, aggressive salt immediately attacks and burns any microscopic cut on the skin. There exists a deep-seated, highly structured cultural mandate to physically explore this land on foot. Hiking, deeply ingrained in the culture and known simply as tiul, is not merely a casual weekend hobby. It is a serious, mandatory national pastime, heavily practiced by individuals of absolutely all ages and socio-economic backgrounds. On public weekends and during long, heavily structured religious holidays, the country's numerous, tightly managed national parks and rugged nature reserves are completely overrun with massive, organized groups of friends and large, loud, multi-generational families. Extensive, meticulously color-coded trail networks, most notably the grueling, comprehensive Israel National Trail, which violently traverses the entire length of the country from the Lebanese border in the north to the Red Sea in the south, crisscross the varied landscape. These trails lead hikers wearing heavy, dust-covered boots through the damp, lush, and heavily shaded pine forests of the Galilee, along the muddy, reed-choked banks of historically heavy rivers, and deep into the dangerous, flash, flood-prone, remote desert canyons. This intense, physical love for the outdoors, this obsessive need for direct, tactile connection with the soil and the rock, serves as a highly powerful, unifying psychological aspect of the shared experience. It is a deliberate, physically exhausting way to fully appreciate and claim the profound, highly varied, and dangerously beautiful ecological extremes of their tiny, fiercely protected corner of the world. This extreme, raw energy of modern society is perhaps most visibly and aggressively manifested in its state of constant, relentless physical motion. The country is tightly bound together by a highly sophisticated, heavily engineered, and ever-expanding matrix of modern infrastructure explicitly designed to facilitate the aggressively fast pace of daily survival. In the heavily congested, densely populated central coastal region, the multi-lane asphalt highways are locked in a near-constant state of heavy, exhaust-choked gridlock during the brutal daily commutes. The private automobile remains a central, highly necessary, and heavily utilized tool for the vast majority of families navigating the urban sprawl. However, the heavily subsidized public transportation system is vast, highly extensive, and relied upon by millions daily. A highly modern, heavily air-conditioned, and rapidly expanding network of electric and diesel trains efficiently connects the major, sprawling urban hubs, offering a fast, smooth, and heavily utilized corridor of movement between the ancient, heavy stone of Jerusalem, the gleaming glass towers of Tel Aviv, the heavily industrialized port of Haifa, and the isolated, dusty desert cities of the Deep South. Yet, the true, grinding, heavy workhorse of the nation's daily transport is the massive, highly complex public bus system. The iconic, heavy green buses of the primary national carrier, Egged, are a ubiquitous, loud, and constantly visible presence on absolutely every single multi-lane highway and narrow, congested city street. These massive, diesel-powered machines reach outward like heavy steel veins into even the most isolated, heavily fortified border towns and remote agricultural villages. The central bus stations located within the hearts of the major cities are massive, multi-level, and incredibly chaotic hives of raw human activity. They are complex, deafeningly loud, and constantly bustling architectural hubs that perfectly, overwhelmingly reflect the relentless, agitated movement of the entire population. This heavy, concrete infrastructure is never static. It exists in a perpetual, loud state of continuous, aggressive development. Massive new multi-lane highways are constantly being violently blasted through ancient stone hills. Heavy steel train lines are being continuously extended deeper into the unforgiving desert sand. And congested coastal cities like Tel Aviv are currently enduring years of loud, highly disruptive, and massive underground construction to build a new light rail network in a desperate attempt to alleviate the crushing urban gridlock. Ben Gurion International Airport, the heavily fortified, highly secure, and massive primary international gateway located on the coastal plain, acts as the vital, constantly pumping lung connecting this isolated geopolitical island to the rest of the globalized world. This constant, heavy physical development, the deafening noise of the jackhammer, and the endless movement of steel and rubber are a direct, undeniable testament to the nation's obsessive focus on rapid economic growth and hypermodernity. It perfectly reflects a deeply anxious society that absolutely refuses to stand still, driven by a frantic, existential need to constantly build, relentlessly connect, and aggressively move forward, striving to physically bridge distances and violently overcome the severe geographical constraints of its tiny, highly contested territory. For the young population born into this geographically constrained reality, the trajectory of coming of age requires navigating a highly unique, deeply pressurized societal path. The formal education system operates with a high-stakes emphasis on rigid academic achievement, heavily focused on the hard sciences, advanced mathematics, and highly competitive technological literacy. However, immediately following the completion of high school, the standard global trajectory of youth abruptly and violently diverges. For the vast majority of the Jewish Israeli population, mandatory military service is an absolute, unavoidable, and deeply formative psychological and physical requirement. Young men are drafted into the Israel Defense Forces for nearly 3 grueling years, while young women serve a mandatory 2-year term. This specific period of service acts as a profound, heavy, and inescapable national rite of passage. It is a highly pressurized environment where 18-year-olds from drastically different, often heavily segregated socio-economic and religious backgrounds, from wealthy coastal suburbs to isolated desert development towns, are forcefully thrust together into crowded, dust-covered training bases. Under the punishing sun and the heavy weight of olive-drab canvas and cold steel, they forge incredibly deep, lifelong, trauma-bonded connections. They are forced to rapidly internalize complex skills of extreme leadership, severe physical discipline, and terrifying life-or-death responsibility long before their peers in other nations have chosen a university major. This specific, heavy experience instills a powerful, unshakable sense of shared national destiny and fundamentally, permanently alters their psychological worldview. Following the immediate heavy release from active military duty, a massive, highly structured cultural phenomenon occurs: the post-army journey. Thousands of young Israelis embark on extensive, months-long backpacking expeditions, typically heavily concentrated in the remote high-altitude mountains of South America or the dense, humid jungles of Southeast Asia. This is a desperate, highly necessary period of psychological decompression, a vital attempt to shed the heavy mental armor of military vigilance and experience a world completely devoid of regional conflict, before inevitably returning to face the intense economic pressures of higher education and professional establishment. The youth culture they return to, particularly heavily concentrated in secular hubs like Tel Aviv, is aggressively vibrant, fiercely independent, and highly globally connected. They exist in a complex psychological duality, attempting to perfectly balance the powerful, gravity-like pull of a highly globalized modern career trajectory with the ancient, deep-seated, traditional obligations of their complex heritage, constantly building their personal futures on ground that is historically unstable. This intense societal duality is perhaps most clearly observed in the dramatic physical and atmospheric shift that takes place as the sun finally sets over the Mediterranean. The daylight hours are entirely defined by raw, aggressive energy, intense physical labor, and the high-volume noise of constant commerce. Construction cranes swing heavy concrete blocks under the blinding sun. The narrow market alleys are a deafening echo chamber of shouting vendors, and corporate office towers buzz with high-stakes financial tension. The daytime is fiercely productive, highly stressed, and aggressively outward-looking. Yet, as the deep blue of twilight descends, a drastically different, almost opposing energy seizes the population. The collective focus violently shifts inward, heavily redirecting toward the protected sanctuary of community, highly structured leisure, and domestic survival. In the dense urban centers, the culinary and nightlife scenes explode with frantic energy. The humid night air becomes saturated with the heavy, thumping bass of underground nightclubs and the loud, overlapping conversations echoing from hundreds of crowded, dimly lit sidewalk restaurants. It is an aggressive, desperate form of socialization, a deep cultural need to collectively burn off the heavy anxiety of the day. In stark, silent contrast, moving away from the chaotic commercial centers and into the quiet, heavily residential neighborhoods, the evening transforms into a deeply private, closely guarded domestic affair. As the heavy darkness fully sets in, the rectangular windows of countless dense apartment blocks begin to glow with warm, yellow light, acting as a collective, highly visible signal of a massive societal retreat into the safety of the family unit. The previously chaotic, loud streets become suddenly, eerily still. The silence is broken only by the muffled, distant sounds of heavy kitchen cutlery hitting ceramic plates, and the faint, overlapping arguments of multi-generational families sharing the final meal of the day. This nightly, stark contrast between the aggressive, desperate public energy of the coastal nightlife and the quiet, highly protected sanctuary of the residential dining table perfectly captures the violently dual nature of a population that constantly demands both frantic social distraction and the deep, heavy, restorative anchor of family. To accurately document the physical reality of daily existence in this specific land without directly addressing its inherent, crushing geopolitical challenges would be to construct an entirely fictional narrative. This is a highly contested region where the heavy, often violent reality of the geopolitical conflict is not an abstract concept. It is a constant, suffocating, and completely unavoidable physical presence in the daily routine of absolutely every single citizen. Security is not a passive background detail, it is the dominant, defining feature of the physical environment. It is starkly visible in the heavy, armed presence of young soldiers standing at concrete bus stops, in the mandatory, highly intrusive physical security checkpoints and metal detectors installed at the entrance of every single shopping mall and public building, and in the underlying collective national consciousness that is permanently, exhaustingly hyper-attuned to the continuous cycle of breaking news. For multiple, successive generations, the population has been forced to biologically adapt to living with the heavy, underlying, and constant psychological stress of sudden, explosive conflict. This permanent state of high alert has inadvertently fostered a highly unique, deeply complex national psychology. It is a strange, highly effective blend of extreme psychological resilience, an aggressive, almost desperate cultural tendency to live entirely and fully in the present moment, and a deeply seated, silent awareness of the terrifying fragility of their physical safety. Coupled with these physical security threats are crushing, relentless domestic pressures. The cost of living in this tiny nation is punishingly high, ranking among the most expensive in the developed world. The aggressive housing market in major urban centers creates massive, suffocating economic anxiety for young families struggling to secure basic shelter. Deep, often bitter social and economic disparities exist between the highly wealthy, secular coastal tech hubs and the deeply religious or physically isolated peripheral towns, creating continuous, heavy, internal, political friction that threatens to fracture the society from within. Navigating this reality requires an exhausting amount of daily mental endurance. In the absolute face of these undeniable, heavy, and constant existential challenges, a fundamental, highly critical question naturally emerges. Why do millions of individuals consciously choose to physically build and maintain their lives on this highly contested, dangerous fault line? The answers are deeply complex, highly personal, and yet they universally revolve around a specific set of powerful, intangible gravitational forces. For the vast majority, there exists a deep, unbreakable, and highly emotional connection to the physical dirt and ancient limestone of this specific land. It is a profound, almost biological feeling of historical continuity, a heavy sense of being an active, necessary participant in a 4,000-year-old unbroken narrative. They stay for the suffocatingly close yet highly protective bonds of the family structure. In a modern, globalized world that frequently feels increasingly isolated and fragmented, this specific society offers a fiercely guarded, deep sense of collective identity. It is the powerful feeling of belonging to a tribe where the physical and emotional survival of the individual is permanently, inextricably tied to the survival of the whole. They remain here for a specific quality of life that absolutely cannot be measured by economic statistics or geopolitical headlines. It is measured in the extreme, blinding warmth of direct human connection, the chaotic vibrancy of the ancient markets, and the sharp, heavy flavors of the earth. They endure the anxiety for the profound sense of shared, urgent purpose. Living here is an intense, deeply felt experience. It is a life that is rarely quiet, never completely safe, and never simple. But it is a life completely devoid of apathy. It is the heavy, grounding sensation of possessing ancient roots that run violently deep into the dry soil, connecting them to a physical space that transcends the modern definition of a mere state. Existence in this tiny, hyper-dense strip of land unfolds continuously in the violent, sparking friction between the deeply ancient and the aggressively new. It is a reality heavily shaped by the ancient echoes of religious devotion and the modern mechanical hum of high-technology servers. It is a territory of terrifying beauty and agonizing complexity, where the heavy, physical ruins of the past serve as the literal foundation for a highly anxious, forward-driving society. The daily routine here is not a simple, linear narrative. It is a dense, heavily textured fabric woven from thick threads of extreme resilience, deep cultural memory, and the constant, desperate drive for survival. In the quiet, heavy moments of the everyday, in the sharing of heavily spiced bread, the aggressive negotiations in the chaotic markets, and the silent, blinding sunset over the dark Mediterranean, one witnesses the true, enduring spirit of a population stubbornly, fiercely living a hyper-modern existence upon an ancient, deeply cherished, and heavily contested ground. If the quiet resilience and the stark, heavy contrasts of this ancient land have left a mark on your understanding of human survival, remain with us on this journey. We will continue to document the hidden corners of the world where the human spirit is forced to endlessly adapt to the